So, for our final lecture on energy, lecture 4.5, we are focusing specifically on energy conservation. So, we've looked at all the various different forms of energy, renewable, non renewable energy, and the impacts that has on sustainability. And in this lecture, we are looking more at energy conservation strategies and how energy conservation can be used as a strategy to reduce overall energy needs in our country and our globally. And we also will briefly look at some obstacles that currently exist to energy conservation. And the final thing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just to focus on the fact that show you that energy use in the United States is actually slowing down compared to previous years. So really just two key terms, new terms for you to focus on in this lecture and make sure you understand. And that is perverse incentives and energy efficiency gap. So there's really two solutions. So first of all, by now it should be very clear that we are concerned about our use of fossil fuels to produce our energy, our reliance on fossil fuels for our energy, and the effect that that has on climate change and other aspects of our environment. And so we have two solutions to this. We've had a lecture on renewable energy, and so that's obviously one of the solutions that our governments globally are working on, is increasing our use of renewable energy sources. But there's also a second part to this that consumers and our governments have a large role to play in, and that's just simply using less energy so that we don't have to generate as much energy. So there's lots of ways in the modern world that we can use less energy. Let's just think about it in terms of lighting, for example. When I was much younger, incandescent light bulbs were the primary form of lighting. It was what we had available to us. And then in the early 2000s, it was all about compact fluorescent bulbs, CF bulbs. And now in more recent years, the focus has become on LED bulbs, light emitting diode bulbs. So we've had a pretty drastic change in technology over the last several decades related to lighting. All of these types of lights produce the same amount of light, but they use radically different amounts of energy. So incandescent bulbs, what we had in the 80s and before, use about 4 times as much energy as the compact fluorescent bulb, which in turn uses about twice as much energy as the LED bulb. So every time we have an advancement in technology related to lighting, we are getting the same product, the same amount of light, for much less energy. So that is just one example of how we are using less energy. We're conserving energy through technology primarily. Of course, there is a trade-off to this, and that is right now LEDs are a lot more expensive than compact fluorescents. It's pretty difficult nowadays to even find an incandescent bulb, but LEDs are currently quite a bit more expensive than compact fluorescents. The prices have been dropping rapidly in the last few years, and they are said to last much, much longer. So in the long run, they do save you money. And as the prices drop, as demand increases and the technology gets less expensive, the energy savings will start to outweigh the price difference, and we will see more LED bulbs being purchased. So beyond just lighting, there are lots of ways in which we can reduce our energy footprint and actually save us money in the long run. So we have high energy efficient furnaces and air conditioning units. We have on-demand water heaters. We can add more insulation to our buildings, to our homes, which then causes our home to be more energy efficient. We can put in new windows, new doors. All of these things are going to reduce the amount of energy that we use and lower our utility costs, and lead us to a net gain in both, both environmentally and financially. Um, this actually is in contrast to just switching to renewables, which actually would cost us money. So, in some ways, reducing our energy consumption is more financially and economically sustainable for us. When I make my home more energy efficient, I am saving myself money because I am not having to pay as much for my heating and cooling. If I switch my home to solar power, yes, I'm reducing my carbon footprint, which is great, but I'm increasing my personal costs because it costs me more money to use solar power than fossil fuel power. So, in some ways, we can, by focusing on energy conservation over renewable energy, we probably have an easier sell to the general public, and can get more people to actually focus on those behaviors. There is another issue at hand here, though, when we talk about energy efficiency and energy conservation, and this is this idea of perverse incentives. Perverse incentives is the idea that the cheaper something is, the more that we'll use of it. So, for example, think about a buffet. You go to a buffet, it's all you can eat. Uh, what do most of us do when we're at a buffet? We overeat because there's an unlimited amount of food. We don't have to pay more for the amount of food that we're eating. So if we want to sort of transfer that to sort of the energy efficiency world, if we make systems more energy efficient, such as heating, cooling, lighting, um, we reduce our need to worry about cost. It costs us less to heat and cool our home. And so then we're going to be perhaps less worried about running our air conditioner all at a low temperature, leaving lights on, etc. So an example would be when we switch from an incandescent light bulb to an LED light bulb. What might happen is instead of reducing the amount of energy that we use, we might actually prefer to create more light. We might leave more lights on or for a longer period of time, and therefore we're not really doing much in the long run to reduce our carbon footprint. So we have to keep that in mind, that human nature can sometimes actually undermine some of our technological fixes to make our world more energy efficient. And that's what the idea of a perverse incentive is. The cheaper something is, the more we'll use of it, and then perhaps we won't actually conserve any energy. However, that all being said, there is a lot of scope in the world to reduce residential electricity use, particularly. In a lot of places in the world, we are still able to we still can change our behaviors and technologies in our homes in such a way that it would make a pretty tremendous impact on the amount of electricity that we are consuming. So, for example, if you look at this figure up on the screen here, we have the red line being California and the blue line being all of the other United States, and how much we use in our homes specifically, how much electricity we consume in our homes. And you can see that California has a very different trajectory compared to the rest of the United States in terms of residential electricity use. And the reason for this is because California has very strict residential energy use standards. So, state governments can set regulations for energy efficiency and energy use. California has very tight standards, and as a result, their consumption of electricity is much lower compared to the rest of the United States. And then, if you were to compare California's electricity use to other developed countries like European countries such as Denmark, the Netherlands, you would see that California still has room for improvement. So, for example, the average Danish household uses about half as much electricity as the average California household. So, that means there's a lot of scope left for reducing our energy demand and using less electricity in our homes. And the reason why I'm focusing on homes is because you, as a home owner or renter, have a lot of control over your residential electricity use. So, what steps can and should local, state, and federal governments take to ensure energy conservation? So, obviously, California's government has done something that is encouraging people to use less electricity in their homes. People in general seem to underinvest in many energy efficiency measures that studies show would pay for themselves within several years. This is referred to as the energy efficiency gap. So remember, that was one of the key terms. Basically, the idea is that even though we know that technologies, we know appliances, we know that cars, we know that adding insulation to our home in the long run is going to save energy, which will save money, we still underinvest in those technologies and those appliances, etc. And so there is this idea of an energy efficiency gap, sometimes referred to as an energy paradox. And governments that have, or countries or states that have successfully reduced electricity use have done so through a variety of different government policies and practices, which I've listed here. And there's a lot of debate among economists and other people about which is most effective, but these are sort of some of the most standard and agreed upon things. And the first thing is we got to get the price right. So energy is not just a magical good that is fundamentally different from other goods and services. We consume energy just like we consume food, and that makes it mean that it should be just as we can set the price right for any other product, we should be able to find how to set the price right for energy conservation. And what I mean by that is basically currently in the United States, electricity and energy is way too inexpensive. We pay very little for our electricity compared to most countries in Europe. And as a result, we do not conserve energy like European countries conserve energy. So this figure shows you the yellow line is the EU, the blue line is the United States, and this is prices. And so you can see that back in the early 2000s, EU and the United States energy prices were almost the same. And through very aggressive government policies, the EU's electricity prices have increased. And a lot of that increase is going towards taxes so that the EU governments have tax money to invest in energy conservation and renewable energy development, whereas the United States has really just increased at a little bit higher than the rate of inflation, quite frankly. So economists would argue that one of the best things that we could do to increase energy conservation is to increase the price of energy, how much it costs to buy electricity. Another thing that could happen is we could change our tax structure. And this, if governments are really serious about energy conservation, they could fundamentally change how taxes are structured. We know that energy choices that we make are largely driven by cost. For example, in 2007 and 2008, oil prices were at a record high. As a result, gas prices were at a record high. I remember we were paying like $4 a gallon for gas. And at that time, the Toyota Prius was the top selling automobile for the first time ever because it was a hybrid. But once prices started to drop, SUVs and trucks once again became the biggest industry sellers. So if we knew as a consumer, if we knew that oil prices were going to continue to be expensive, we might make vehicle choices based off of knowing that we're always going to be paying $4 a gallon for gas. So what some economists and politicians would argue is that we need to shift taxes. So here in the United States, we don't like to talk about taxes. We don't like to talk about paying more taxes. Paying more taxes is never going to fly in the United States. Um, you're not going to be able to sell that. But what some economists argue is that we need to shift our taxes. So, not raise taxes, but instead of paying income taxes, paying consumption taxes. So, paying taxes on what we consume. And the idea is that this would give people more choice in how and when we pay taxes. So, we would have, if we were to shift to a consumption tax, people would have a larger degree of choice over the amount of taxes they pay. And so you would be taxed on your electricity and not on your income. Some people argue that that would actually cause us to reduce energy use. However, the caveat to this is there's a really common objection to consumption taxes, and that is it would disproportionately impact the poor, who don't necessarily pay income taxes right now or pay very low income taxes. So um, this is a hot button item. It's interesting because it comes up every election cycle. So we have income taxes versus consumption taxes. I'm not saying it's necessarily a solution. I'm just saying it's one of the tools that is available that might reduce how much energy we consume. Thirdly, we could provide more information and we could sort of nudge consumers. So basically, the idea is that we think consumers still have fairly limited understanding about energy and energy conservation. And so there are people out there who say the government needs to provide more direct information to households and nudge them, like encourage them in such a way that maybe saying, like, well, your neighbors are doing this, so you should do this too, things like that. And that actually has been found to be effective, is to use peer pressure. And then finally, governments could establish regulations and standards. So the California government, for example, has very high fuel efficiency standards for all vehicles that are sold and in the state of California. If you are to sell a car there, it has to meet higher efficiency standards than the rest of the country. That's one of the reasons why their energy consumption is lower. They also have higher energy efficiency standards for buildings. So if you're building a new building in California, there are building codes that require certain standards be met for energy efficiency. So the government can certainly play a role in setting all of this. Another example would be the Energy Star program here in the United States. If you have an appliance, bought an appliance, have one in your house, you've probably noticed the Energy Star sticker on the appliances. That was a government-sponsored program through the Environmental Protection Agency, whereby if your appliances met certain energy consumption or conservation standards, it got to have the Energy Star sticker on it. Unfortunately, this is one of the programs that our current president has proposed cutting. It has not yet been cut because the budget, we don't have a budget yet that has gone through Congress, but it is not a current priority of our current government, is having energy efficiency, the Energy Star program at least. So those are some of the things that government can do, the role that they play in energy conservation. And that pretty much concludes module 4, sorry. And hopefully you have a better understanding now of where we're kind of at currently in terms of fossil fuel use, futures for fossil fuel use, options for renewable energy, pros and cons of renewable energy, and the role that energy conservation plays in all of this. So at this point, you're ready to take your final quiz for this module and you will be done.